Some cars try very hard to impress you. They sparkle under showroom lights, growl in commercials, and throw around words like luxury, performance, and prestige, as if repeating them often enough will make them interesting. And then there are cars like the Lotus Esprit, cars that do not try, cars that show up, stare everyone down, and somehow make everything parked next to them look like office furniture. The Esprit belongs in that second category. It is not a car that says, "Please admire me." It is a car that says, "Why are you all still here?" That is the first thing that makes the Lotus Esprit special. The first time you see one, especially an early one, the reaction is not just admiration. It is confusion first, then curiosity, then respect. Because the Esprit does not look like it was designed to fit into its era. It looks like it landed in its era by mistake. It is sharp, low, flat, angular, and weirdly aggressive in a way that makes most other sports cars of the 1970s look soft and slightly overdressed. While the rest of the automotive world was still flirting with curves and old-school elegance, the Esprit arrived looking like someone had weaponized a ruler. And that is why it stands out so much. The typical British sports car image was already well established by the time the Esprit arrived. Small roadsters, classic proportions, curvy lines, lots of charm, lots of tradition, and usually at least one electrical issue waiting patiently in the dark. The Esprit did not care about any of that. It did not arrive like a polite gentleman in a tweed jacket. It arrived like a designer in sunglasses who skipped the meeting, hated compromise, and somehow still got promoted. It was British, yes, but not in the comforting way. It was British in the way a thunderstorm is technically just weather. That sense that the Esprit did not belong to its own time is a huge part of its magic. Even now, decades later, it still does not fully feel like a period piece. Many classics are beautiful because they capture the spirit of their age. The Esprit is different. It feels like it was built from an alternate future imagined by the 1970s. A future where everything is geometric, dramatic, and just slightly hostile. It is not merely stylish. It is confrontational. It does not ask for approval. It assumes you are already behind. So where did this machine come from? Why did Lotus, a company known mostly for lightweight, brilliantly handling sports cars, suddenly decide to build something that looked like it belonged in a science fiction film? Because Lotus needed a halo car. It needed something dramatic, something that could sit at the top of the range and tell the world that Lotus was not just building clever little driver's cars for purists in corduroy jackets. Lotus wanted something people would put on bedroom walls, something exotic, something aspirational, something that would make other manufacturers deeply uncomfortable. And for that, Lotus turned to Giugiaro, which, frankly, was the design equivalent of bringing a flamethrower to a candlelit dinner. Giugiaro did not just design cars, he designed statements. The Lotus Esprit was one of his boldest. Its folded paper styling was one of the defining visual languages of the era, but on the Esprit it felt especially extreme. The car looked less sculpted than sliced into shape. Every line had intention. Every surface looked like it had been ironed flat by someone with anger issues and exceptional taste. The early Esprit, especially the S1, barely looked like a production car at all. It looked like a concept sketch that had somehow slipped past management and made it all the way onto the road before anyone could stop it. That is part of its charm. It feels improbable. Cars like this are not supposed to happen. They are supposed to be toned down, softened up, made more practical, more marketable, more boring. The Esprit somehow escaped that process with most of its madness intact, which is why, even today, seeing an early Esprit feels less like spotting an old sports car and more like witnessing a design rebellion on wheels. Of course, being a Lotus, the Esprit was never just about looking dramatic. Underneath all the angular theater was the company's core philosophy, and that meant one thing: Colin Chapman. Chapman's entire worldview could basically be summed up as simplify, then add lightness. Which sounds elegant and intelligent because it is. It is also the exact opposite of what much of the car industry has spent decades doing. Where others added weight, bulk, complexity, and gadgets, Chapman believed in agility, responsiveness, and driver involvement. Lotus was not obsessed with brute force. It was obsessed with feel. The Esprit carried that philosophy into a more exotic, more expensive, and far more theatrical package. This was never a muscle car in a tailored suit. It was not built to dominate conversations with horsepower numbers alone. It was built to communicate with the driver, steering feel, balance, chassis response. That was the real point. The Esprit wanted to be driven, not merely accelerated. That distinction matters. A lot of high-performance cars are fast. Fewer are actually alive. The Esprit, at its best, felt alive. And that gave it a very different character from the big names it inevitably got compared to. A Ferrari wanted to seduce you and intimidate you at the same time. A Porsche 911 projected an almost annoying level of engineering confidence, as if it had already calculated your mistakes before you made them. The Lotus Esprit felt stranger than either, more fragile in some ways, more raw in others, less polished, less predictable, but also more theatrical. It did not feel like a perfectly finished answer. It felt like a brilliant, slightly unstable argument, and that made it interesting. Then James Bond got involved, and the Esprit's already unusual story became gloriously absurd. Because in The Spy Who Loved Me, the Lotus Esprit did not just appear on screen as another cool movie car, it transformed into a submarine. At that point, it stopped being merely a sports car and became an event. Most car marketing works very hard to convince you a vehicle can handle rain. The Esprit looked at the ocean and said, "That counts." It was ridiculous, unforgettable, and absolutely perfect for the car, because the Esprit already looked like it belonged in a futuristic fantasy. Turning it into an actual underwater machine only confirmed what everyone's eyes had already been suspecting. That Bond moment mattered enormously. It elevated the Esprit from niche exotic to global pop culture icon. Bond cars always benefit from cinematic myth-making, but the Esprit was especially well-suited to it because it already looked like fiction made real. It did not need much help. The film just turned the volume up. Suddenly, the Esprit was not only a fascinating British sports car, it was the wedge-shaped Bond car. The one that could turn from road weapon to submarine because apparently ordinary greatness was not enough. And yet, the Esprit did not freeze in that one famous form. It evolved. Over the years, it changed from the pure razor blade sharpness of the S1 into more muscular, more mature, and more powerful versions. The turbo models gave it more punch and more attitude. Later redesigns, especially under Peter Stevens, smoothed and modernized the shape without destroying its identity. That is harder than it sounds. Plenty of cars age badly because every redesign either panics or overcompensates. One minute they are icons, the next they look like someone redesigned them using focus groups and regret. The Esprit avoided that fate better than most. It changed, yes, but it never completely lost the thing that made it unmistakable. Across the S1, Turbo, Stevens redesign, and finally the V8 era, the Esprit kept the same essential presence. It remained low, dramatic, and unapologetically exotic. Each generation got a little brawnier, a little more serious, a little more refined, but the car never fully abandoned its original mission: to look like the future and make everything else seem slightly irrelevant. By the time the V8 arrived, the Esprit had become a far more intimidating machine. It now had the performance to more convincingly back up the supercar looks. But even then, it never felt as clinical as a Porsche or as operatic as a Ferrari. It still felt like a Lotus, which meant it still felt a little eccentric, a little defiant, and a little too committed to the bit. In other words, still excellent. Now, obviously, this is the part where reality arrives wearing muddy boots and ruins the fantasy, because the Lotus Esprit had problems. Real ones. Not, oh no, the cup holders are too small, modern problems. Proper, old-school automotive problems. Reliability concerns. Build quality questions. The kind of issues that tend to appear when a small British manufacturer with limited resources decides to build an exotic car that looks like it was designed by the future and assembled by optimism. The British auto industry of the era was not exactly famous for flawless consistency. That is a polite way of saying it occasionally behaved as if quality control was an optional side quest. Lotus, being a small company, did not have the resources or manufacturing discipline of the larger giants it was competing against. So while the Esprit looked like it belonged in the same conversation as Ferrari and Porsche, ownership sometimes reminded you that appearances can be deeply, deeply misleading. This became one of the car's biggest limitations, because image matters, but trust matters too. A Porsche 911 built a reputation for being a performance car you could actually live with. Ferrari built a reputation around passion, glamour, and scarlet drama. Lotus Esprit built a reputation for brilliance, beauty, and the possibility that it might choose inconvenience at the worst possible moment. That makes it harder to become a mass-market legend. Even when people love a car, they like to believe it will start on purpose. And that is one of the reasons the Esprit never became a commercial icon on the level of the 911 or Ferrari's V8 line. It had the looks, it had the charisma, it had the cultural footprint, but it never quite had the broad confidence of a product people could buy without a second thought. It remained a little too risky, a little too niche, a little too specific. In other words, it became something arguably better than a mainstream legend. It became a cult object. That is why the Esprit still hits so hard today, not just because it is rare, or because it is linked to Bond, or because it is pretty. Plenty of rare old cars are forgettable. Plenty of movie cars are gimmicks. Plenty of pretty cars say absolutely nothing. The Esprit says a lot. It says design mattered. It says driving feel mattered. It says a small British company once had the audacity to build a machine that looked outrageously futuristic, and then somehow kept evolving it for decades without sanding all the character off. It also helps that the Esprit still looks strong today. Not merely good for its age. Strong, especially the early cars. They do not feel nostalgic in the usual sense. They feel strangely displaced, as if they still have not fully settled into history. Most classics remind you of the past. The Esprit sometimes feels like a future that never quite happened. That is a rare kind of visual power. You do not see it often. And that is exactly why the car has become such a prized collector's piece and such a beloved cult machine. It sits at a strange and fascinating intersection of design history, British engineering philosophy, pop culture mythology, and automotive stubbornness. It has Giugiaro's lines, Chapman's obsession with lightness and feel, Bond's cinematic blessing, the drama of turbocharged evolution, and the late punch of V8 power. It contains all of that while still feeling unmistakably itself. But maybe the most important thing about the Lotus Esprit is that it is not perfect. In fact, perfection would probably make it less interesting. Perfect machines earn admiration. Flawed, charismatic machines earn obsession. The Esprit belongs in that second group. It is memorable precisely because it is not a smooth, sanitized success story. It is a car with edges in every sense. Visual edges, mechanical edges, historical edges, emotional edges. It can frustrate you, charm you, impress you, confuse you, and make you grin all in the same afternoon. And in a modern automotive world full of cars that are engineered to offend absolutely no one, that kind of personality feels almost rebellious. Today, everything is optimized, measured, market-tested, filtered, softened, and explained. The Lotus Esprit feels like it escaped all of that. It is too low, too sharp, too strange, too dramatic, too committed to being itself. It has too much identity to be modern in the corporate sense, which is exactly why people still care. So yes, the Lotus Esprit is special, not just because it is beautiful, not just because it is fast, not just because James Bond drove one into the sea and turned it into a submarine. It is special because it represents something rarer than performance or prestige. It represents audacity, the audacity to look different, the audacity to prioritize feel over brute force, the audacity to build a road car that looked like a science fiction prop, and then keep refining it without killing what made it weird in the first place. The Lotus Esprit was never the easiest car to own, never the safest bet, never the most rational purchase. But rational purchases do not become legends. Rational purchases commute. Legends arrive low to the ground, sharp as glass, and looking like they came from a future clever enough to be dangerous. And that is why the Esprit still matters.